Welcome to this talk. My name is John Fiddler. Inevitably, the preparation for this talk has meant much work, and that means that I have depended upon a lot of people for help. So a few thank yous are in order. As always, the staff at the Oldham Local Studies and Archives, both past and present, have been of invaluable help, as I have found actually over the past 50 years and more. I'm that old. Add to them that valuable source contained there. To anyone delving into Oldham's history from the 1850s to relatively modern times, they are bound to seek out the much missed Oldham Chronicle, as advertised by these two young ladies in the newspaper in 1920. Every copy of that paper can be seen in the local studies, although I warn you it is on microfilm and a few paracetamols would not become amiss. Kath Ball and Peter Jones took on the task on Oldham Council's behalf to organise the centenary recognition of the First World War as it affected our town, acknowledging the efforts and the sacrifices that the people of this town made. I shall refer briefly to their work later. There are various books on the local history shelves that have added to my research. General books on war memorials that refer to Oldham, and books of local research like the one for Waterhead. Individuals have also been helpful. Martin and David and Pat and Anne Ashton and Peter Fox and Jeremy Sutcliffe and Roger Ivans. All have chipped in with their threepennyworth and more, and I assure you, every little has helped. I must mention my technical team, Steve and Karen, my daughter, who make the Zoom element of this work actually succeed when I haven't got ATLU. Finally, the Oldham Research Group, History Research Group, who persuaded me when, to be honest, I didn't need that much persuading, to add this talk to all the others that I've done over the years. So to each and every one of you, thank you. The title that I chose is Lest We Forget. Geoffrey Stuttert Kennedy was a famous Anglican padre who in the First World War insisted on being with the men as far forward as he was allowed and sometimes beyond that. He brought them comfort and encouragement, and in their shaking hours of need, cigarettes to calm their nerves. There was much calming to do. He became affectionately known as Woodbine Willie, and I want to begin and later to end with one of his poems. He knew of Flanders and the Somme. He knew the pain and the terror, the mud and the blood and the stench of war. He knew its butchery, its agony. And he wrote this short poem, still pertinent today. Waste of muscle, waste of brain, waste of patience, waste of pain, waste of manhood, waste of health, waste of beauty, waste of wealth, waste of blood and waste of tears, waste of youth's most precious years, waste of ways the saints have trod, waste of glory, waste of God, war. But now, it was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month 1918, and there was joy abounding as the quietness of the guns had settled throughout the war zones. But also grief still abounded. There were wives without husbands, children but no father, families everywhere with the empty chair, and the joy of the peace soon turned to concern. Could they now just forget the fallen, as they were often called, the dead like Frank Morrison, a sailor, and the first Oldham casualty of this war, within less than a week of its beginning in August of 1914? Could they forget the wreckage across France and Belgium which had caused so much death and injury? Could they forget the gas? Could they just now ignore the destruction? Could they ignore the mothers who gave their sons and whose grieving ran deep? A poet, in fact the same poet, put words in a mother's mouth. His was my body, born of me, born of my bitter travail pain, and it lies broken on the field, swept by the wind and by the rain. Could those who survived now forget? And all over the nation and beyond, there was a resounding no. Something must be done to honour the sacrifice of so many, and in doing so, maybe, hopefully, help to assuage the stream of tears that still flowed. And so within weeks of that 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, and maybe even before, all over the nation, plans of some sort of acknowledgement were being discussed, and not just at national level, but in cities and towns and villages, in churches and chapels, in schools, in mills, in foundries, political party offices, and so many more. In 1922, King George V was anxious to honour the dead of the Great War. There was getting on for 1 million of them. And he wanted to make a visit to the graveyards of northern France and Belgium. Already there, military cemeteries were being laid out, and the King and Queen Mary, along with Field Marshal Haig and a few others, went there between the 11th and 13th of May of 1922. Later that year, an account with photographs was published. The King wanted that visit to be low-key. He wanted no great speeches, no banquets, but the Belgian and the French people wouldn't let it be low-key. They had to give their thanks. They had to show their gratitude that what Britain had done for them so they could retain their freedom. And just before they set off on that pilgrimage, a lady called Mrs. Jane Matthews from Devizes in Wiltshire wrote a letter to Queen Mary. She told the Queen of her son, Sergeant Alfred Matthews, of the Royal Army Service Corps, and that he had died on the 19th of December 1918. You'll notice that is after the end of the war. And that he was buried at the cemetery at Étaples on the coast south of Boulogne, near army hospitals. And in that envelope, Mrs. Matthews enclosed a sprig of forget-me-nots and begged the Queen to place it on her son's grave. As she said, she would not herself be able to travel so far. On that day, the Queen was actually unwell, but the King carried out the mother's wishes, as these two pictures show, him standing before the grave and then placing the spray of flowers carefully upon it. This is the grave, and this is the vast Étaples cemetery that we visited this summer. The Matthews family, mother, father, wife, were typical of the anguish of so many. The grave over which they could pour out their grief, if only for a moment, was not possible. And add to those whose loved ones had not been found and who had no place to go. The great monuments to the missing, like this at Thiepval and this one at the Menin Gate, had not been erected. And so, as if in anticipation, especially when the government proclaimed that the multitude of bodies would not be repatriated, plans all over the nation were being suggested, being discussed, being laid out, and some even begun for local war memorials. And this is not just the local community war memorials, such as those of Oldham and Royton and Crompton and Chadderton and Failsworth and Saddleworth one and Pots and Pans, but also for smaller areas, Clodic, Waterhead, Osterlands, Coldhurst, etc. And then add to these memorials in churchyards, inside chapels, in factories and offices, in police stations, in fire departments, in town halls. These often took the form not of monuments but of tablets and included names some for all who served, and some just with the names of the fallen. And whatever sort the memorial was, those proposing them had to answer some questions. Where should they be placed? What form should they take? Whose names, if any, should be included? Who would design it? Who would make it? And of what material? What words would be used? What theme would the memorial have? From where would the costs be met? And how much was needed? And please don't think that the war memorials were only in the form of a monument or a tablet. As we shall see, money raised could be put to a variety of uses. Nor were appeals for finance for war memorials the only appeals facing the people of Oldham. There was competition. There were other calls on people's pocket. And I was amazed at what else was being presented as worthy of financial help between 1919 and 1923, as I read the Oldham Chronicle for those 5 years. Here quickly are some of them, and all of them you'll see have merit, and I assure you it's a quick run through these. The Mayor's Prisoner of War Fund, Henshaw's Bluecoat School, the Mayor's Fund for Russian Relief, the Mayor's Appeal for the Restoration of the Parish Church Bells, the Oldham Royal Infirmary Jubilee Appeal, 60 years after it had begun, the Mayor's Fund for the Relief of Distress, and you'll see that also people not only gave money, but coal merchants gave coal. The Great Depression was beginning to start. The War Orphans of Shaw and others, the Children's Free Meals, Springhead Relief Fund, Crompton Relief Fund, the Japanese Distress Fund, Old Manchester University Appeal, the League of Nations, Save the Children, the Blind Appeal, the Lifeboat Appeal. Don't know if you knew that Oldham had a lifeboat. I think it was at Abersock. The first churchyard memorial was unveiled as early as April 1919, just 5 months after the armistice. It was unveiled at a children's service at St Mary's, the parish church of Oldham, on Easter Day. And this memorial really did spring from the grassroots. A lady called Mrs Stevens of Egerton Street had the idea, and no doubt helped by a number of friends, set about raising the money in small amounts in the streets around. And in those days on the old St Mary's estate there were plenty of streets, and many would not be able to give more than a copper or two, a penny or two. The widows might. But eventually she collected between 40 and 50 pounds. I worked out that that is 10,800 old pennies, if you remember those. The vicar and the church agreed to Mrs Stevens' request for a memorial cross to be placed in the churchyard, and she said that she hoped that families would lay flowers at the foot of the cross to mark a beloved fallen soldier or sailor's birthday, and so, she said, keep their memory green. You'll have noticed that only soldiers and sailors were mentioned, but on the same page, when I read about that story, there was also another story. Lieutenant William Dawson of the RAF had died on the 17th of July 1918. It would appear that the death of an airman was too novel to be thought of as in the same breath as a soldier or a sailor. I checked on Lieutenant Dawson. His parents lived on Huddersfield Road. His body was never found, and his name is on the memorial at the city of Arras. The cross in the churchyard is on its pedestal 9 feet high, composed all of stone, and it is still there in the churchyard. And last week on Remembrance Day, the Mayor of Oldham placed a wreath on that stone cross as well as on the war memorial, as mayors have done every year. While up and down the town plans were being considered for war memorials of all sorts, the council also had to think about arranging for the Day of the Peace, a celebration day. As one Oldham councillor remarked, aye, bearing in mind the cost. Well, I don't know if the council actually bore the cost in mind too much, because they gave a grant of £5,000 and appointed a committee. The Peace of Versailles was signed on the 27th of June 1919, and that mattered. It made a line in the sand that the war really was over. But Oldham was ahead of the game, 4 months ahead. A report in February indicated that when the day of peace arrived and the treaty was signed, there would be illuminations and treats, the latter for the children, but also for people over 70. Soon there were more details. There was to be a civic procession to a service of thanksgiving. Public buildings and others were to be decorated. There was to be a bonfire, an illuminated tramcar, fireworks in the park. It even named the buildings that were to be lit up. Just imagine it, Oldham lit up. The town hall, the library, the art gallery, the market hall, Mumps Bridge, the Lyceum, Werneth Fire Station, Hollingwood Tramways Department, the park entrance, Cannon Street Institute, even the cooling towers at Green Hill. Oh, and there was to be a searchlight display as well. Peace mattered, and it should be celebrated and it should be enjoyed. So much so that the buildings that were lit up were going to be given the electricity to do that free of charge. And remember that in those days Oldham owned its own gas and electricity supply. The event would take place on the 19th of July 1919. I have to tell you that 2 months later the council increased the price of electricity by 15%. What is given with one hand is taken away with the other. So for the peace, Oldham was to be en fête, and there were souvenirs like this one, and a souvenir mug which I spotted on a friend's shelf in her kitchen only 2 or 3 weeks ago. There was another peace gesture too. It was early March in 1919 in Royton, and a Mr. Norris Bradbury made his gesture in gratitude for the peace. If you have walked in Tandle Hill Park, well, that was his gesture, his gift to the people of Royton. 100-acre plus park to be freely open to the public for pleasure, kept in a natural state with no buildings placed upon it, no alcohol served and no political demonstrations. The Chronicle stated, Royton Council was minded to agree. You bet it was, and it did so unanimously. And the chairman, sensing the excitement in the meeting, announced to the members that they could leave the meeting departing from their usual decorum. I suppose that's the 1919 equivalent of high fives. One quote from the report said, "People should be able to walk on the grass and not be told, keep off the grass." Later that month, the Cron reported on the desire of the people of Royton for a war memorial, and the plan was to be in 2 parts. Firstly, there was to be a monument, and the remainder of the subscriptions were to be used for educational scholarships for children of the fallen soldiers of Royton, and names were to be collected to that end. In fact, during the next 2 years, a number of war memorials were unveiled in Royton. At the parish church, with a total of 71 names. At Tandle Hill Park, a memorial described as an obelisk 37 feet high, with a bronze figure of peace 11 foot high. It will be facing Royton, and on it there will be 400 names, and it was begun in January of 1921. Some memorials have a recognition of the war. This one emphasised the peace. It was unveiled by Lord Derby on the 20th of October 1921, by which time some of the money collected had already been donated to education, plus £200 to the Oldham Infirmary Fund. Normally the infirmary depended upon endowments and gifts and donations, and £200 went to the Royton District Nursing Association. As it turned out, Tandle Park was too far away for an Armistice service, and wreaths were left around the town at other churches and other sites. More than that, the weather appeared rather quickly to take its toll of the Tandle Hill monument. However, St Anne's Church had, even before the war, intended to erect a wayside cross at the junction of Oldham Road and Windmill Street. I must tell you that Broadway was thought of and planned and had just about begun to be laid out. But now, after the war, they decided that they would unveil the wayside cross that they'd planned years before, and this one now will be dedicated to the fallen. Increased traffic on as Broadway was completed resulted in that memorial being moved to an island in the middle of the road where Oldham met the new Broadway. Frequently, the plinth of that memorial was damaged by increasing traffic. It had been rounded off to make it that bit safer, but in January of 1938, a lorry laden with milk bottles approached from Rochdale, and it completely destroyed it, as this not very good picture shows. I might just add that milk bottles were empty. After some years of indecision, the cross was re-erected in a modified form in St Anne's Churchyard, and as these two photographs show, it is still there. In more recent times, and with space restricted at St Paul's, a new modern style monument has been erected in the park, complete with the names of the fallen of both First and Second World Wars. In Chadderton and in Crompton, the road to the erection of their memorials ran more smoothly, and by March of 1919 both Crompton and Chadderton were appealing for subscriptions that indicated their intent. In Chadderton, by the summer, discussion had concluded with 4 suggested schemes after the unanimous agreement for a war monument, which was to be in a public place as a permanent reminder to Chadderton lives lost and an acknowledgement of the grief and the anxiety that had enveloped the district. The 4 other suggestions on how the remainder of the fund could be used were a public park, playing fields, a stone drinking fountain, a social institute. I might just add that the committee formed to raise the money had 18 members, 17 of whom were men. By May, the chairman was able to proclaim good progress, with many mills, and there were many mills in Chadderton, in donating £100 and over. He was concerned about the money coming in from private individuals. They seemed to be unsure how much to give, and his answer was quite simple. Anything you can spare. Remember the widow's mite. Every little will help. In fact, all those 4 suggestions were rejected. It was said, well, they're not suited to a war memorial subscription fund. They should be provided by the council anyway when the normal money becomes available. By September of 1920, 5,500 had been collected. 3 architects had submitted sketches, up to a £2,000 maximum spend. And the rest of the money, which they hoped would soon reach 8,000, was going to be spent on scholarships so that children of the fallen, if they were clever enough, could pursue further education. The site was a no-brainer. Immediately, they said, it's got to go in front of the town hall. As long as the monument, as one man said, as long as the monument is in harmony with the town hall building. The chairman's comment was firm. I will make sure that it enhances it. More controversial was what the sculpture should represent. Should the figure be a soldier or a symbol of peace? They settled on an obelisk on a plinth, a bronze figure of a soldier in full uniform, but posed as a sentry, a guard rather than an aggressive warrior. The words, in honour of the men of Chadderton, who made the supreme sacrifice, and in grateful remembrance of all who served their country in the war 1914 to 19. Remember there were still servicemen active in Palestine and indeed in Russia. The sculptor chosen was a Mr. Albert Toft, more of him later. There are no names on the monument, and in the brief time I had, I could find out no place where those names could be looked at. Scholarships were awarded annually and announced in the press. There were a total of 220 orphan children of fallen soldiers in Chadderton and almost 2,000 children of those who served. The announcement of the unveiling was to be Saturday, the 12th of November 1921, but in fact it was moved forward to the beginning of October, the 8th actually. At a meeting in September, the councils of the War Committee and War Memorial Committee met, and they said, it's all ready to go. Why should we wait to November when the weather may not be as favourable? Let's do it right away. They toyed with the question of who should perform the unveiling. The first suggestion was an ex-soldier, but it was pointed out that this war memorial was to all who served, so that in effect the ex-soldier would be unveiling the war memorial to himself. And that was deemed to be not a good idea, and it was rejected. The second suggestion was that a war widow should unveil the memorial, but some said that would be far too trying for her. The task too upsetting, she will be overcome with grief and break down. There were 17 men after all on this committee, and so that idea was rejected. They turned instead to Mr. Ernest Kempsey, a well-known local councillor. 9 years before, he had laid the foundation stone for the present town hall that would stand behind the war memorial. And here are 3 photos of that war memorial, 2 of them today. The unveiling successfully completed. The vicar's rallying call was hats off to the past, coats off to the future, and England will be her great self again. Not far away in Crompton, the recognition of grief and hardship was, as I've said, prompting ideas for a memorial. The call for subscriptions was sent out. In Crompton, money didn't roll in quite as fast as been as anticipated, and 14 months later it was reported that only 2/3 of what they'd hoped for had actually been raised. Nonetheless, the committee agreed that they had enough for the monument to go ahead. They chose a Mr. Goulden. He'd been able to point to his war memorial in Glasgow as an example of his excellence, and they liked his sketches. He'd done those in February of 21. Interestingly, the Chronicle refers to Army, Navy and Air Force at this point. The Chronicle also tells us of the site and gives a description of the monument. It is to be an allegorical piece, a youth thrusting back savage monsters and encouraging the coming generation of children, climbing upwards, helping each other. In addition, care for the fallen soldiers' children was going ahead, and Mr. Goulden also visited the town early in 1922, and the site was agreed with just a few minor changes to street lines. Time seemed to drag, but an illness to Mr. Goulden might explain all of that. But they'd raised £10,000 and soon they were ready to go, and Mr. Goulden had recovered. So it was that the unveiling took place in ideal weather and with a crowd, it is said, of some 15,000 on Sunday the 29th of April 1923 by Sir Ian Hamilton. Actually, he had also unveiled the older memorial the day before. And here are a series of photographs of that monument in Crompton, one showing the sculptor's name, R.R. Goulden. Beneath the Crompton War Memorial there is a sealed leaden casket, watertight, I hope. I wonder what you would place in such a casket if you were given that task today. Well, we know what they put in it because the Chronicle gave us a list, and I tell you now it's a long list, and I shall rattle through it at speed. In that casket there was a copy of the local newspaper, a photograph of the statue taken from a mould, the price of food in Crompton that week, medals issued for the King and Queen's coronation 12 years before, and a programme for Crompton on Coronation Day. There were coins, a sovereign, a half a crown, a shilling, a sixpence, a threepenny bit, a penny, no mention of halfpennies or farthings. A programme from the opening of the Crompton Free Library, the annual report of the Crompton Sick Nursing Association, ration tickets from the local food office during the war, I'm only halfway through, the Crompton Tradesmen's Association Almanac, the history of show in bygone days, a list of subscribers to the War Memorial Fund, 3 cops of yarn spun at the Moorfield Mill, a length of fustian cords spun at the Clough Mill, a programme of the peace celebrations in Shaw in 1919, the first report of the Crompton Disabled Soldiers and Sailors Association, the names of the oldest inhabitants of Shaw, the number of Crompton men killed in the war and the total of those who served, with some interesting details about them, details of the Memorial Front from its start to its conclusion, a report of the first meeting in 1919 in March, and a list of the members and the officials of the council. There is no mention of the size of that casket, and I could find no photographs of it. I wonder how much of it would have survived if it was opened today. But the original subscriptions were for lasting monuments, so the day may never come. I might add 2 further things. I said the weather was ideal. Well, the Chronicle homed in on the work that the St John's Ambulance Brigade did, raising the fainted to their feet again. And secondly, a few days prior to the unveiling, it was decided to change a little part of the wording on the memorial. Someone noticed that the wording referred only to Shaw, and it was pointed out that Shaw was only a small part of Crompton, and that Crompton should be the word on the memorial. And as you'll see from these 2 photographs, so it now is. The Failsworth War Memorial accentuated the peace. It was unveiled on the 10th of June 1923 and was rededicated in 2007. The Chronicle describes it as an inspiring ceremony, and on the monument is the winged figure of victory and the words, "They died in many lands, that we may live here in peace." There are no names on the memorial, but that was a rather splendid memorial it is today, and well worth a visit. Behind the memorial, I noticed there was a plaque of the Failsworth coat of arms with the motto. If you don't know what the motto of Failsworth is, and you can't guess, it is "True worth never fails." In Lees, the committee met early in January of 1919, and an advert requesting subscriptions eventually appeared, but not until May. However, in September of the next year, the question was being asked, what's happened to the War Memorial Scheme? Is it ended or is it mended? Why have Waterhead and Austerlands got one and we haven't? And the answer was, well, not enough money has come in. The mills have made their contribution, but not ordinary people. And one councillor's comment, perhaps rather harshly, was, if it was left up to the people, Leeds, there wouldn't be enough for a medal. And that seemed to be the problem. The scheme had not caught the popular imagination, so wallets and purses were remaining closed. What was noted was that money had been collected 20 years before for the Boer War, a Boer War Fund, and perhaps some of that was left, and someone suggested £400 from that would help. However, by late summer and early autumn of 1921, the pace had quickened and the Lees Monument was ready for unveiling at its original site at the junction of High Street and Hartshead Street, and it was unveiled on the 12th of November 1921. Here's a sketch of it. However, traffic would build up over the years and there was fear that it would be damaged. And so in 1949, it was lifted off its pedestal and the whole thing was moved to a better setting where there was much less chance of traffic damage, and you will find it at the entrance to the cemetery, there with suitable words but with no names. And these are pictures of today's monument taken this summer. There was a meeting in Spring Head in January of 1919 of the council, and at that district council meeting someone said, there seems to be a rumour going around that we're going to have a war memorial. And the council said, well, we haven't started the rumour, we don't know anything about it. And I could find nothing after that until an article in late November. And from that I discovered that the Spring Head Memorial would not take the form of a monument, but of scholarships for the children of servicemen. They had hoped for £2,000. They had received 250. They hoped for more, and I hope they got it, but I don't know whether they did. In Waterhead, there was also a demand for a war memorial, and they asked permission to build it on public land from the Oldham Council, and that was readily given. The fund was more or less complete, and the site they wished for, where the memorial is today, was what they chose: Brydeoak Street, joining Haywood Street. Not on the main road, but on a small triangle of land at the junction. The question asked was, should it be a war memorial or a peace one? And the answer was, it's a war memorial celebrating the peace. Another question was, why not drop it, like Holland would have, and support the Oldham Memorial? And the answer was, too late, we've already collected the money. And so the Waterhead War Memorial Committee went ahead. The unveiling was done by well-known councillor Elisha Bardsley. The monument is described as an effigy of a private soldier in fighting kit, rifle and helmet uplifted, hailing final victory. And the sculptor was an ex-soldier called George Thomas. The weather, the Oldham Chronicle report said, was kind, until the moment that the last post was sounded and the notes faded away, and then the Waterhead drizzle set in. There had been a large crowd, people at every window that overlooked the site, and on top of the nearby Coach and Horses Inn were a large number of boys and youths. Elisha Bardsley in his brief speech was blunt. He said, Sir Douglas Haig has said that that's the government, Sir Douglas Haig had said that the government was not doing their duty. There's a large number of disabled men not able to find suitable work at proper wages. This, he said, must be remedied. Soldiers no longer looked for charity. They demanded justice. If employers didn't act, then the government must make them do it. Sounds to me like an early idea of a minimum wage. A year later, the Waterhead War Memorial Committee showed their gratitude to Elisha Bardsley for all the hard work he'd done. He's obviously the driving force. And they presented him with a too-high bronze replica of the soldier of their memorial. I wonder where that replica is now. In his reply, Elisha said, quoting Henry VIII, "Today I have touched the highest point of my greatness." He knew that of all the things he did for Waterhead, and there were many, this mattered. A comprehensive account of the Waterhead War Memorial is to be found in the local studies on the shelf there. It mentions the demolition by a doctor's car that crashed into it, the theft of the soldier's bayonet and its chance find, its move to a safer place, its restoration to its original splendour. All of those are found in that detailed account, and it really does look impressive. I knew that there was a monument at Austerlands, but I could find nothing in the Oldham Chronicle about it, and so I simply went to the Austerlands Memorial and took these 3 photographs. That too is worth a visit. Instead of going on a pub crawl, perhaps you might want to go on a war memorial crawl. And if you do, Austerlands should be included. And so to Saddleworth. I am much indebted to Peter Fox of the Saddleworth Museum for photos and information, and this brief reference will not do him justice. It would appear that a temporary memorial funded by a local mill owner was placed in the square at Upper Mill and eventually set up in St Chad's Gardens in Upper Mill itself, and is still there today. And these are Peter's photographs. Of course, churches and chapels throughout Saddleworth had appropriate plaques of wood and stone, elaborate or plain. I decided to go and look for Delph's war memorial. I drove to Delph and I parked by the cemetery thinking that was a likely spot, and as I got out of the car, two elderly gentlemen who'd been out for a stroll came down the track nearby. I said to them, "Excuse me, can you tell me where I will find Delph's war memorial?" And one of them said, "We haven't got one." And the other one said, "But we will have soon. We're having a meeting about it." I thought that was a joke, but apparently they were very insistent, unless they were very good at concealing their joke, that there was going to be a meeting, and eventually Delph will have a war memorial of its own. Slow wheels turning in Delph, I think. However, there was soon a move for a war memorial to reflect the whole of Saddleworth. To cut what would be a very long story short is necessary. Where to place it? What about here, on the bleak top of the hill by the boulders? It was possible to get there, and this is the first time it had been arrived at by motorised transport. They did make it to the top apparently, and in that year. Colonel Brooke, who owned the land and the stone, received a letter from the council. They said, "We'd better write this on council-headed notepaper. It'll carry more weight." They said they wanted to know if he would give permission for them to erect their war memorial on his land at Pots and Pans, so that it could be seen from almost every part of Saddleworth. A regular reminder of sacrifice made. Colonel Brooke agreed. Plans were submitted by a well-known architect, Mr. Howcroft. Peter Fox sent me photographs of both his plans. The first, complete with cannon, seemed to be a bit elaborate, I think, a bit perhaps too militaristic, and it was rejected. The simpler second one was preferred and slimmed down. It is 50 feet high, made of millstone grit that was obtained nearby, with 6 steps and with bronze tablets bearing the names of the fallen. The cost would be about £2,000, and it is 1,400 feet above sea level. This is a slightly modified photograph of it. I can't help but read the chronicle account of the stone laying of the Saddleworth War Memorial in May of 1923. It speaks of the hardy nature of the Yorkshire folk of Saddleworth, especially when the sun isn't shining. And on that day, it certainly wasn't. Mrs. Schofield had been invited to do the stone laying, and I want to read you a few extracts from the Oldham Chronicle. The report is headed Pots and Pans Memorial, Foundation Stone Laying During a Hurricane. 1,400 feet above sea level, high over banks of impenetrable rain clouds, and in the face of a hurricane which swept over the bleak moorlands, the foundation stone of the Saddleworth War Memorial, in the course of erection on the famous Pots and Pans, was laid on Saturday afternoon by Mrs. G. Schofield. The spectators were very few, owing to the inclement state of the weather. A procession was out of the question, and the band of enthusiasts, or should devotees be a better word, struggled up the hill as best they could, arriving on the summit of the hill bedraggled, mud-splashed and wet, but with ardour unabated. Strange as it may appear, women equalled men in numbers. As far as possible, the beautiful service which had been arranged by Canon Drury and the Reverend Nicholas was gone through in the shelter of the workman's shed. Moving on to the platform which had been erected round the base of the memorial, and on which it was difficult to stand in the high wind, Mrs. Schofield said, and she may well have said it very fast, In the name of the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost, I lay this foundation stone of the memorial to be erected in the memory of the men of this district who sacrificed their lives in the Great War for the cause of freedom and honour. They returned to the shelter of the shed. And Mr. Howcroft then gave Mrs. Schofield a pleasant surprise. He said, on these occasions we always give the person who lays the stone the trowel or a mallet. But we are doing better. We have arranged for a complete model in bronze of the memorial, every detail carefully brought out. And he presented that on behalf of the War Memorial Committee. And I wonder where that is too now. Mr. Schofield said that they were met together to, this is Mr. Schofield now, said they were met together to inaugurate another stepping stone in the history of Saddleworth. And the memorial would, he trusted, be an emblem to show for all time that the people had not forgotten and would never forget the gallant men and boys who upheld the traditions of their fathers and gave their lives for their country. Saddleworth men and women, he said, were ever independent. Freedom was their watchword, and the mere shadow of a foreign yoke would not be tolerated for a moment. Those lads willingly gave up their lives, and it was for those who survived to see to it that they did not die in vain. The world was not yet free, and never would be free, until it was recognised that, and then he quoted from the Old Testament book of Proverbs, recognise that a good name is better than great riches, and a loving favour better than silver or gold, and that righteousness becometh a nation. The secretary of the War Memorial Committee then spoke about why they'd chosen that site. He said, it will be visible from almost every part of the district in early morning, and in the dusk of the evening it would stand as a silent but nevertheless eloquent testimonial to the courage of the Saddleworth lads who died that we might free. The elemental wars of wind and weather on the moortop have a kind of kinship with the stress of battle storm under which unhappily Saddleworth lads went down. The unconquered moorland around it would keep alive in us the unconquerable spirit that carried us through those fateful years. Pots and Pans is a strong, valiant height, and it is with the valiant dead that the proposed memorial has to do. Stirring words. Alderman Hill, on which Pots and Pans Memorial stands, yielded to the efforts of the builders, but it took 5 months before the monument was ready. It was unveiled by Viscount Lascelles, later the 6th Earl of Harwood, son-in-law of King George and Queen Mary, on the 6th of October 1923. On that memorial there are some 260 names, and in 1951 those of the Spring Head were added, as were the 68 Saddleworth names of World War II. There had been an alternative demand for a war memorial in the form of a cottage hospital. It would appear that medical facilities in Saddleworth were not very brilliant in the early 1920s, and it was thought that a cottage hospital would be a great memorial. But it fell on deaf ears, and it would appear that ex-servicemen actually preferred the memorial, that people constantly should be reminded of what war could bring and how the ex-servicemen had suffered. And here's the sheep, also grateful to be able to shelter by the monument. I went also to Denshaw, and I found their war memorial at the entrance to the churchyard. And here are 3 photographs. 1 taken from Peter Fox's photographs, and 2 which I took, and which also show the names on the memorial. It might be worth noting that not all schemes took off. At Waterloo, on the Ashton-Oldham boundary, the scheme there was very quickly dropped. A committee had been formed, and they hoped to raise between £5,000 and £6,000. They called a public meeting, and they were disheartened when only 6 people turned up, and the scheme was ended. In Hollingwood, awash as it was with mills and ironworks and Ferrantes, they committed their hope for a good response. They planned to use the site known as the Little Park, sometimes called Seymour Gardens. But the response was well below expectations. Some said that firms were not subscribing because they were subscribing to the Oldham scheme. Others said, well, we're not impressed by the idea of a war memorial anyway. We prefer a bowling green. That too landed in the ditch. It was also noted that churches and chapels were planning their own. I was once told that Hollingwood was oversubscribed with churches. St Margaret's was hoping to raise at least £700, and so the Hollingwood scheme was abandoned. However, in March of 1922, a war memorial was unveiled at St Margaret's and is now the de facto war memorial for Hollingwood. At the unveiling, it was announced that they were £50 short of the money that they needed to raise, but they felt sure that on unveiling day that £50 would be forthcoming. It wasn't. They raised £25, 4 shillings and 11pence, so they were still £24, 15 shillings and a penny short. You'll just have to trust my maths with the pounds, shillings and pence. Today it is available to welcome those who come on Remembrance Day, though I might just add that their memorial service will be after their church service and not at 11 o'clock. But on that war memorial are also the names of civilian dead from the Second World War, when on Hollingwood was badly bombed in October of 1941. The Chronicle records a multitude of other war memorials, as monuments or as tablets or as simply framed lists, and this is a rapid sprint through half a dozen or so as examples. The Colders Parish Church. The fund raised by March 1919. It is described as being in the churchyard of simple design, a 10 to 12 foot high cross, and it was unveiled in October 1922 before a large crowd. Today it is just sad, as these pictures show. Bourne Street Primitive Methodist Church in Hollingwood was closed in 1972. A memorial tablet with 24 names of the fallen and 138 names of the returnees was unveiled. And here are pictures of both of Bourne Street. Hollingwood Congregational Church had a memorial tablet set in an iron frame. And here are pictures of the church with its well-known clock tower. Royton Parish Church had 62 names and a beautiful oak chancel screen. Werneth School had an oak memorial tablet, and I'm grateful to Jeremy Sutcliffe, who kindly sent me this photograph. Wesleyan Methodist Sunday School at Cow Hill unveiled a mahogany tablet with the names of 17 dead enclosed in a wreath with the names, lest we forget. The Labour Club at Roscoe Street has a long article about the unveiling of their war memorial, and in the course of that article it describes how there were nearly 15,500 disabled discharged men in Oldham, ex-servicemen with varying degrees of disability, some of them totally. That there were nearly 1,800 war widows on a register, and they knew that there were many people not registered. The article said that 30,000 men had served from the town, and at the time of this unveiling, many were still actively in the armed forces. Also in Oldham, the council had many other things on their plate, many other plates to keep spinning. The Spanish flu had not gone away. Smallpox still persisted. New housing was desperately needed. Much planning was going on. The Hollins and Barishua estates were moving forward, but also slowly. On one page there was a heading, "Dirty Houses." That indicated the problem. References to rats and mice, bugs and fleas. And the council had to work out what to do, what they were allowed to do, what they could do about it. They also had to consider, though it would appear fleetingly, the suggestion for adopting a French town, twinning 1920 style. I found no other reference. And then there was, well, in a sense, a bombshell. Something came unexpectedly. The news that the Royal Lancashire Agricultural Show was to come to Oldham, to Limeside. Why is it coming here, people asked. We're a mill town, a cotton town, factories and foundries, machine shops. Why should it come to Oldham? And yet Oldham had lots of farms. In Chadderton, in Royton, in Crompton, Moorside, around Limeside itself. But it provided a headache for the council. They would have to supply gas and electricity, water mains, telephone and telegraph facilities. This was to be a huge event. I might have said it came again 6 years later, so perhaps they thought they were very good at it. Exhibits would come from all over the British Isles. So it was another thing, and a large thing, for the council to ponder. As with the other areas, Oldham itself had much to memorialise. From the town, over 5,000 had been killed. So many families had received that telegram they never wanted to receive, the news they didn't want to hear. As the poet wrote, a little scrap of paper in a yellow envelope, and their whole world was a ruin, even hope. The bravery, the call to duty, the fortitude, the sacrifice of all the armed forces, and the grief of all their families and friends seemed of necessity to find expression in a clear and a public way. It would appear that that was what a town as significant as Oldham must do. It was, after all, a leading town within the nation, the leading town of the leading product of the nation's trade, cotton. A town like Oldham must do its best to provide a very impressive war memorial. Remember, Oldham soldiers have been in action, in the thick of the action, on the Somme, at Passchendaele, at Ypres, in Italy, in Gallipoli. Some moves to plan to raise money, to select a design and a site for a monument, as we've seen, went relatively smoothly. For Oldham, the road was less smooth and certainly full of twists and turns. Of necessity, it will be necessary to travel this road with some speed. But if you stand in front of Oldham's War Memorial, with the parish church in the background, it is hard to think that Oldham made a mess of the attempt. Indeed, Oldham's War Memorial is acknowledged as something worthy, indeed something of a gem. So let's go to the beginning. As with in other places, in early January, only 2 months after the armistice, thoughts were being turned to how this should be memorialised. There was a letter in the Oldham Chronicle proclaiming a novel monument, a road, no ordinary road either. Oldham should have, said the Chronicle, its boulevard of honour, to befit the bravery and the sacrifice of its fallen men. The reader's name was Hardwick Green. I don't know whether Hardwick Green was male or female, but he or she proposed starting this road at the lower end of the park at King's Road, along King's Road through to Strawberry Gardens, on the road to Alt, and at the bend of Lee's New Road. He claimed that this road would be mostly flat, would take a double tram line, that land was cheap so housing could be built along the whole road and the area opened up. And if the Guide Bridge Oldham Railway were to be electrified in the future, and you never know, additional stopping places could be provided. and the whole of the boulevard he envisaged would be lined with trees, and on each there would be a nameplate with the name of a fallen Oldham soldier or sailor or airman. And he concluded, "Good homes and surroundings are more than half the battle in combating the various evils in our midst, and the attainment of my object would ensure success both morally, physically and financially." It was a bold, far-sighted idea, and I could find no further reference to it. 5 weeks later, an Oldham War Memorial Committee had been appointed, and a site for a monument had been discussed, and immediately there was a problem. It quickly became clear that there was no one obvious site. In fact, it was lamented that the centre of Oldham had no open spaces at all, and certainly none suitable, obviously suitable for a war memorial. The early runners put forward were two. The old Oldham Marketplace, which I take to mean at the top of George Street, the top of Manchester Street, at the top of West Street, at the bottom end of Henshaw Street and the start of High Street, in what, as I was growing up, was known as the Marketplace. That was the first suggestion. The second suggestion was to put the War Memorial in the vicinity of the Town Hall. The committee agreed that more suggestions needed to be made. And by March 1919, a subscription list had been opened. And there was general consensus on two things. First, the money raised would be put to a monument. And secondly, further money would go towards scholarship for the children of the sailors and soldiers who had been killed. And they also added Alexander Park as a site, a suitable site for the monument. The borough surveyor pointed out that the site near the town hall would involve the demolition of some property to make it big enough and therefore be expensive. And there was a lengthy editorial in the Chronicle pleading that Oldham should concentrate on getting a fitting and worthy monument, worthy of the sacrifice of the fallen and their family and friends. Not to do so, said the editorial, would be unworthy of the town. Future generations will honour them, it said, that is, those contributing to the success of the appeal. Future generations will honour them and will despise this generation if the memorial is not worthy. It is best to aim high and boldly test the people to see how generously they will subscribe. Soon afterwards, a completely different take from the president of the Discharged Soldiers and Sailors Oldham branch. He said, never mind a monument. The first call of the funds should be on alleviating the distress of the disabled men and their families. And then the second call should be on the building of a recreation hall for the disabled. And building it would also help a little towards solving the unemployment problem. He pointed out that the Mayor's Prisoner of War Fund had £12,000 in it. That could be a useful use of that money. And on the 5th of April 1919, the Chronicle carried the announcement placing before the town the proposed use of the Memorial Fund, and all that gentleman's ideas were ignored. The aim was £20,000. There was to be firstly a monument, secondly the scholarships, and thirdly donations to the infirmary. And the following week, and indeed this happened every subsequent week, on the front page of the Oldham Chronicle was a list of the subscribers for that period of time. And the very first list showed that £2,189 had already been subscribed. Oh, and it mentioned 13 shillings as well. Dame Sarah Lees and her daughter Marjorie had given £400, and at a rough and ready estimate, for an ordinary man that was a year and a half's wages. The Co-op also gave £50. And 2 weeks later, when the next list was published, the fund had reached £5,500, a quarter of the total had already been achieved. And by September it had reached more than half, £11,141 8 shillings. But they said it's not coming in now as quickly and as regular as it should, as we want it to. Something is needed, something to stir the imagination, to open people's wallets and purses. And so it was that a pageant was proposed. It would last, they said, for almost a week. It would be held in Alexandra Park. The Chronicle said it would have entertainments and various attractions on a scale never seen in the park before. It would meet all the taste of all classes of the community. There would be stalls with items for sale from local traders. There would be fairgrounds, there would be boxing tournaments, Pierrot entertainers, a display of high diving into the small pool, degree of accuracy needed there, I think, a carnival on the large lake, a tournament each day by the Royal Horse Guards, and they would end each evening with a military tattoo, pastoral players, confetti battles, whatever that is, aquatic displays, band performances, and a brightly coloured official souvenir. And the advert called, especially for people who live near the park, for a big display, bright display of flags and buntings. That pageant raised £4,000. And when they said, when we think how quickly we had to arrange it, how late in the year it was, and the fact that one day was almost a complete washout, £4,000 was a very respectable and welcome addition to the War Memorial Fund. But still, no monument. 1 year on from the end of the war, the town, like the nation, set about honouring the fallen, recognising the pain and thanking God for the peace. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month would be Armistice Day. It was a Tuesday. It would be the first Armistice Day after the war. What were people expected to do? How were they supposed to acknowledge Armistice Day? They didn't know this was the first one. The Chronicle carried a long notice. There would be silence for 2 minutes. All traffic would remain stationary. Quote, so that the thoughts of everyone may be concentrated on reverent remembrance of the glorious dead. It was believed that business and pleasure would gladly be interrupted for the 2 minute silence. They called for a generous display of flags and buntings yet again. Flags would fly at half-mast during the 2 minute silence, and the event would take place in front of the town hall. The Chronicle described it as a big crowd at a simple but impressive ceremony. In many, in fact in the majority of mills, engines were stopped and operatives ceased work around the time of 11 o'clock. In other mills, there were complaints from management that many of the operatives were going straight to the town hall, and so some mills just simply closed for the day. In another mill, the operatives went straight to the town hall and then decided to come back to the mill. But once they were there, they decided they weren't going to do any work. And so the management locked them in. It didn't work. The fire escape was their escape that day, and the mill was closed. At a Royton mill, the workers crowded into one of the big rooms, and a spinner who had served in the Manchester Regiment sounded the last post, and they had their 2 minute silence. The first Armistice Day was inevitably emotionally challenging. At Christmas, the mayor gave treats to the children of soldiers killed in the war. And if you think a treat meant a packet of dolly mixtures, you're wrong. It was organised by 2 officers of the Oldham Regiment at the Cooperative Hall at Hill Stores. 1,300 children were identified. 15 special cars, charabancs I suppose, were used to collect the children. Outside, the weather is described as dismal, but inside there were illumination, entertainment, a concert party, conjuring, food, a stately Christmas tree with electric fairy lights, toys suspended from the branches. These children with no father now, these orphans were given as merry a Christmas as it was possible for them to have in the circumstances. By February 1920, it was still undecided where the site of the older monument would be. They had rejected a small plot of land in High Street. I have no idea where that could have been. The market site would need enlarging, and that meant removing premises, they said, up to Curzon Street and round to Henshaw Street. The site of the town hall would mean acquiring buildings in Church Terrace up to Church Lane and acquiring the Greaves Arms to create a large enough space. So what did they decide? They decided to have another meeting. By May, Councillor Greenwood was getting fed up. It's time something was done. This discussion's lasted 18 months. If we're not careful, some of the subscribers will have been dead and buried before the scheme gets carried out. What about using the money instead for improving the town? The mayor placated him. He said 3 sculptors will be visiting Oldham next week to give their recommendations. And 3 weeks later, the sculptors had been and gone, and the sites suggested were the front of the town hall, the marketplace, and Alexander Park. The problems were therefore still repeated. Sites A and B were too small and would need enlarging, and that would take 2 or 3 years anyway before the monument was unveiled, in other words up to 1923. Someone said, well, what about putting it temporarily in the park? That was squashed more or less immediately. All that could be agreed was the scholarship part of the War Memorial. That could go ahead and details and costs were laid out. Councillor Greenwood again said they needed a site that was cheap so they could use the money for town improvements. That was the same edition where that heading of dirty houses in Oldham that I found came from, the one that mentioned rats and mice, fleas and bugs. By July, the first scholarships of the scheme were being awarded, and schools and children were named in the Chronicle. There were 4 girls and a boy. By October of 1920, Mr. Toft is the chosen sculptor. There's a book on war memorials in the local studies that tells of his expertise and lists Mr. Toft as among the first 3 or 4 eminent sculptors of the country. And the Chronicle produces a very poorly reproduced picture of the sketch, indicating the cost of £10,000. The central part of this memorial was called by Mr. Toft the Sacred Chamber, and that would have doors at each end, and the names of the fallen would be on marble or bronze panels inside, with places for flowers and trophies and battle honours. How they were going to fit all that in there, I have no idea. It would be lit by electricity and well ventilated, and outside would be the simple lettering, 1914 to 1919, Mors Janua Vitae. The Latin with the meaning death is the door to everlasting life. The top of the monument would have 5 figures in bronze, showing the character of the men. You have to imagine them leaving their dugout, some climbing and their leader standing tall, beckoning them on. And the height of those figures would be between 12 and 14 feet high. That was the plan. But again, it was Armistice Day, the second Armistice Day. A Thursday, there'd been a leap year, a Thursday, and again it was outside the town hall. And again the Chronicle recorded the event. Noble utterances, especially by the minister, the Reverend G. Shillito of Hope Congregational Church. 2 years ago, he said, the sunshine came out on a morning like this one, and they saw the flag of England flying and knew that it had not been stained. Emotional words for an emotional day. And at 11 o'clock, mills ceased and lessons in schools were paused. and by mid-1921 more scholarships had been given, this time 3 each to boys and girls. By September of 1921, the Mayor, perhaps sensing that some positive news about war memorials would be welcome, wrote to the Chronicle to announce that Mr. Toft had speeded up his work. He had said it would take 2 years, and now he was saying it will be done in 1 year. Indeed, the clay model was almost ready for the War Memorial Committee to go and view it, inspect it, and if the council approved, it could be sent to the founders for casting very soon. You will notice that in that Mayor's letter there is no reference to where the monument would be placed. The reason is because they didn't know. Or rather, they had decided on the marketplace, but then in December they decided against it. They needed, they said, to rethink. The next week it was clear that the council have turned to the town hall site, but the finance committee said no, that's far too expensive, and Councillor Schofield agreed. So another proposal was made, called the Little Park on Union Street. Officially I always called it the Oldham Park. The one between, that little space between the library and what was then the post office, where the local studies centre is now. But it was pointed out, well, we've already set that land aside for a museum, so that's a non-starter. At another point, another pointed out that Mr. Toft had said, my ideal site is the old marketplace. And the committee went into private session. It's almost as if they didn't want the reporters to realise the embarrassment of their indecision. A few days later, the War Memorial Committee went together to inspect the town hall site, the Union Street site, and a new one at the corner of Union Street and King Street, where the Grand Theatre was, what became the Gormont Cinema and what was it, Bailey's and other names down the years. And the result of that inspection was that the Borough Surveyor was asked to prepare plans for all the sites mentioned. 2 months passed, and late in January of 1922, Mr. Toft was asked to come to Oldham to give his opinions. Before he came, it was suggested in favour of the town hall site that it would be more acceptable if the Greaves Arms were to be demolished. Otherwise, the space there for a memorial would be too small. And then someone had another thought. Would it help if the part of St Mary's Churchyard wall was pushed back? They said the graves there date back 90 to 150 years. They've remained untouched. Some said went back as far as the American War of Independence in the 1770s. In the meantime, various council members went to view sites yet again, but this time they took with them what the Chronicle described as a dummy memorial. Now, I don't know what you think of with that phrase dummy memorial, but I thought of something the shape of the memorial with something equally the shape of the bronze figures on top, and that would be stood in each of these sites, and that from that they would get some idea of what the thing would look like. But I didn't know what that dummy looked like. I looked again through the Chronicle, couldn't find any description, looked through the council minutes, couldn't find any description, and then I had one last go at the Finance Committee minutes. And there it was. Very disappointing. What would that dummy like? It said, the canvas framework representing the size of the war memorial. So you've got to think of just some poles, some bits of wood in that shape, an oblong, and then something on top. If not, probably not on top, probably the wood just stretched that height, and that's all they had. But they reckon that by using that and looking at it, they could work out the proportion, the viewing points, the sight lines, what the background would look like, and all that sort of things. But Mr. Toft's views were clear. None of the sites he regarded as favourable or suited to his design. And I do regret, he said, you abandoning the Market Square site, because that's what my sculpture was meant for. It has 4 sides, all equal in interest and in value. The viewer needs to be able to follow them round. It needs to be enough space like there would be in the Market Square. He needs to see them from a reasonable distance. At the Greaves Arms, he said, the site there only has one view at a reasonable distance. The background of the Greaves Arms itself is an extremely ugly background. That's one problem. And if you wanted to see the monument from that side, you would have to go into the public house and look at it through the window. And in any case, all those gaudy adverts stuck to the place spoilt it. He said the little garden in Union Street is too hemmed in and too low down. The site near the Grand Theatre is little better. In fact, he said, all are unsuitable. I will accept that the Alexander Park could be my second choice, but ideally it should be in the old Market Square. And among the councillors, each site had its supporters and others who derided it. Councillor Schofield again said, it certainly shouldn't be put in Alexander Park. How many people go to Alexander Park? Who would go to look at it? They might as well stick it on Oldham Edge. But the council revert to that, so the council revert to the market site. Well, they did for a short time, but within days it was being challenged. Councillor Schofield declared himself again. I do prefer the town hall site, he said. What are you going to do with the public conveniences in the marketplace? Just think of the cost of moving those. And you say, well, there's a public house in the town hall square. Well, there is, but there's 4 public houses at the marketplace. At least there's only the Green Arms by the town hall. So, some supported one, some derided it. And you could almost sense the chairman getting absolutely fed up, because suddenly he says, next business please. Next month, April 22, brought a new decision. They'd had another meeting and now they'd chosen Alexander Park as the chosen site. In fact, what's happening, of course, as you can see, is that the finance council are putting forward proposals, the finance committee say that's too costly, so they look at something else and the finance committee says that's too costly, but some people are very much in favour of them irrespective of the cost. Someone said the marketplace is too crowded for such a sacred and holy thing as a war memorial. Others said the park is too far away for an armistice day. But voting in the end, after all that, was for the park. Settled. The decision is made. But no. Look at the heading 2 months later in June of 1922. What's the heading? Not yet settled. People thought it had been, it hadn't. Apparently, councillors had been overwhelmed by the amount of letters of protest coming in. Verbal communications had been made. And the mayor had said, I want permission to reopen the agreement. Let us revoke the park settlement and let us look quietly and coolly at it again. It would be silly to put the monument in the park and then regret it and have the cost of moving it somewhere else. Others said, well, the market square, just look at the housing, how poor it is. Oh, some of it is uninhabitable. What sort of background is that? There's an underground lavatory there. Okay, you could camouflage that, but it doesn't have to be an eyesore, but it's not very fitting. And it is such a hemmed-in spot. It's a place for shopping and for trade. It's a busy junction, all those roads leading to it. And others said, well, when we put the dummy there, it looked fine. The vote to reopen the discussion was carried by 1 vote, 18 to 17. The decision, after they'd played around with the ideas, to adjourn, or as we would say these days, kick the can down the road, was also carried by only 1 vote. In July, Mr. Toff let his views be known again, because he'd been told, or he'd heard, that the site opposite the town hall was now again finding favour. He pointed out that in other towns, the war memorial had been in bustling, crowded centres, and people seemed to get on fine with it, and he insisted that he preferred the marketplace. But there had been words with the church, and the church seemed to be quite happy, amenable to pushing back the church wall, and so giving more room for that site by the town hall. There was another question that they had to answer too, because there was another complaint. Some people were saying, why are we having a Latin inscription in Oldham? How many people speak Latin in Oldham? And the Chronicle said, English was the tongue of the men who went out to war, the men whose sacrifices and service this memorial wall will commemorate, and no other language does not fittingly tell of their devotion, nor the sorrow and the pride of those who watch from afar. It must be in English, and that's why today it is. By September, the Chronicle could use again the word progress with greater certainty. No objection had been made by the church, so it had agreed to the removal of certain old graves and tombstones. No coffins had been found. Few bodily remains had been brought up, and they had been reinterred reverently in another place. So the foundation of the war memorial was actually and at last being laid. They said it will be laid within about a week, and it will be set within 10 days, and it would be in front of the town hall. People actually came to see that concreted bit being laid, as if they said, we better see it before they change it. The pedestal then would eventually be raised on top of that, and then the bronze memorial placed on the top of that, and it would be soon. Would it be ready for Armistice Day of 1922? After all, Mr. Toff let it be known that the unveiling could take place on that day, and so Oldham set about gathering the names of the fallen for the plaques, and the relatives could send in that information for the 2 Oldham regiments, the 10th and the 24th Manchesters, and indeed of any other local men who had fallen in the war. And they were asked to send in their names, their rank, their regimental number, the date and place of their death, and their home address. And when all that was collated, the bronze plaques could be made. So all is well. No, another hitch. They would not be able to unveil the monument on Armistice Day. Why? They had received negative replies. They'd invited General Haig, and he said, I'm sorry, I'm booked. They'd invited General French, leading British general, and he said, I'm sorry, I can't come that day. They'd invited Sir Ian Hamilton, and he said, no, I'm booked. Of course they were booked. They were being invited for the 11th of November, Armistice Day. They were in demand all over the place. And in any case, they said, the churchyard alterations are not yet completed. And in any case too, the church bells had been sent to London to be retuned. They were back, but they hadn't been rehung. So we better set another date. And so Armistice Day of 1922 was the 4th without a war memorial. The Chronicle editorial found the words once again, and they came in their thousands. The Chronicle said, when the bugle sounded from the steps of the town hall on Saturday morning at precisely 11 o'clock, there stood, closely packed together, a great gathering of people, the men bareheaded and many women with tears in their eyes. It was the public celebration of Armistice Day. There are many thousands for whom the 2 minutes pause on Armistice Day means something more personal and intimate than merely taking part in a public tribute to respect for the dead. For the parents who lost their sons, For all, in fact, who lost their loved ones, whatever the relationship, Armistice Day is a unique and solemn day of significance, and there are many such in Oldham. The last post and the singing of O God, our help in ages past added to the solemnity of the occasion. As the weeks passed, the churchyard clearing continued and the work was eventually done. And in February of 1923, the Chronicle was able to inform the town that the unveiling would take place on the Saturday the 28th of April, and that it would be conducted by Sir Ian Hamilton, who had been in charge of the Gallipoli operations, in which the Oldham Territorials, the 10th Manchesters, had played such an important part, and which had suffered such severe losses. And the church bells had been rehung and were ready. But, yes, there's another but. The Chronicle again declared the news. Would you believe it? Apparently, the base of the War Memorial was the wrong way round. It would have to be taken down and rebuilt. Of course, it had been laid down some weeks ago and was now thoroughly bedded in. It only became obvious to all when the sculpture was hoisted on it to its place on top of the sacred chamber in the presence of a large crowd. They'd come to see this long-awaited War Memorial, not for its unveiling, but just for its putting the various bits into place. And that's when it was revealed. The back view was to the town hall and Yorkshire Street. The soldier gazing into the distance was actually taking a close view of a block of buildings in Church Terrace. The pedestal was not square, it was 10 by 8 feet. The door entrances should have faced the church and Yorkshire Street, not the Greaves Arms and High Street. The sculptor, Mr. Toft, was asked for his thoughts, but before they got them, they were already working day and night to correct the error. It had to be done quickly, it had to be ready for the end of April, and it was already the end of March. Mr. Toft's view was to repeat what he said. Really, it doesn't matter. It's not really a blunder. There is no back nor a front. It was designed to be seen from all angles. All angles are equal. The monument had to be seen in the round, he said. It tells a story, it's a sequence. Remember, I did it originally for the marketplace. But, whatever you say, I will accept. And so, at last, the twists and the turns of the road were over, and the day of Oldham's unveiling of its War Memorial had arrived. The editorial for Saturday the 28th of April 1923 is beautifully, eloquently and movingly written, and alas is too long for me to read. The weather was beautiful, and the largest assembly which ever was being gathered in Oldham must have numbered, they said, 10,000 people. Sir Ian Hamilton wore Highland dress and his Glengarry cap, and as arranged unveiled the long-awaited memorial at 4 p.m. Ex-servicemen, relatives of the fallen, the disabled, orphan children often carrying little posies, all had their allotted place. The band was even using a field telephone to make sure that they were warned exactly when Sir Ian would appear. And they got it right. As Sir Ian appeared, the band struck up with "See, the conquering hero comes." And Sir Ian unveiled the memorial. He was also renowned for plain speaking like Elisha Bardsley. He talked of the sacrifice in foreign fields, exemplified by the row of crosses in Flanders and in Belgium, and those in Gallipoli buried beneath the lilies. But he was scathing about how those who had returned were being treated, the unemployed, the homeless, trade throttled. The futility, he said, the futility of demanding the humiliation of Germany. In that, he said, are the seeds of war. And the church bells rang. And the little daughter of Walter Mills, who had been gassed at the bar in France, and who later had been killed in an heroic action for which he received posthumously the VC. His little daughter placed the floral tribute on behalf of the British Legion at the foot of the War Memorial. And so it was that on the 11th day of November 1923, Armistice Day was celebrated for the first time at the Oldham War Memorial in front of the town hall. A few days before, the Oldham Brewery, the owners of Oldham Brewery, had agreed to tear down the front of the old Greaves Arms and rebuild it in a more fitting style, and also push back 3 yards to give more room for the memorial to be seen in the way Mr. Toft had explained. Armistice Day in 1923 was a Sunday. Nearly 20,000 gathered around and far beyond the new War Memorial. There were people on top of the church tower. 2 little girls who were named, Mary Massey and Nellie Batley, whose fathers had been killed in action, carried that day the large British Legion wreath. And I saw in the report, for the first time, the term Remembrance Day. On the walls of Oldham Churchyard are to be found today the names of over 1,800 men and 1 woman commemorated as the fallen of World War I, who by birth, by marriage or by occupation had a link with Oldham. For the centenary celebrations, Kath Ball and Peter Jones checked the records of these men. They combed the newspaper and a host of other sources, and they realised that there were many, many names missing. Missing perhaps because relatives never offered the details, because they didn't know about the scheme, because they clung to the hope that their loved ones were somewhere still alive, and to see their names on a bronze plaque was too painful and too final. The result of Kath and Peter's work can be seen in a new wall in the garden of the Remembered in the parish churchyard. It contains nearly another 2,600 names. As I close this talk, I want to ask for information. If you can help, can you tell the good people of the Local Studies and Archives on Union Street, due to move shortly and temporarily to the library, and they will let me know and they will have a record because they don't know. And my question is this: when were the bronze plaques on the churchyard walls behind the War Memorial placed there? When were they put there? They're not on the photographs of 1923, nor in the few years afterwards. Were they placed there after 1945? Were they placed there when the memorial book to the fallen of the Second World War were included? I don't know. I made a number of inquiries, but to no avail. If you know, will you please hand that information in to the Local Studies and Archives. This is the War Memorial book to the Second World War, whose pages, as you probably know, turn every midnight. I know of no other such in the country, and I think it is a very good idea that Oldham used this system. That book honours the names of the Oldhamers in the armed services of World War II, but also the civilian dead, like those killed in the Abbey Hills V1 bombing on Christmas Eve of 1944. And as you look at that page, you will see that the first name is Edward Wilde. I went to take that photograph, as you can see, on the 16th of October. And as I stepped back from the war memorial, I noticed some flowers. And when I looked more closely at them, I saw that they were in his memory. They, his family, 82 years later, had not forgotten. He, at least, had been remembered. At the start of this talk, I said I would begin and end with a poem by Geoffrey Stuttert Kennedy. I call the talk Lest We Forget. He reminds us of the consequence of forgetting. Let me forget. Let me forget. I am weary of remembrance, and my brow is ever wet with the tears of my remembrance, with the tears and the bloody sweat. Let me forget. If you forget, then your children must remember, and their brows be ever wet with the tears of their remembrance. If you forget.